think why we're doing anything. And so again, so I've added the why cheekily at the end to make it a smartie, which is one of those colourful little smarties. But it makes it memorable, a nice memorable mnemonic. And I've used this in countless projects that I've worked on, building requirements, documentation, and keeping requirements traceability. It makes sure that there is always good focus on every aspect of what. So, does anyone have any questions? Okay, so the reason why I started with this is because I want you guys to keep this in mind as I go through the case studies. You'll see this theme will continue. So our first case study is around the very recent, or still in play, operational resilience in UK. So financial services gone through lots of issues and incidents over the last over a decade where technology failure has had some catastrophic events. So 2012, so RBS and NatWest did a software update which had issues, rollback, and the rollback failed as well. And this impacted 6.5 million customers. Over a period of a couple of weeks, it took them to repair that. So the FCA and the PRA came down quite heavily on them. Then making sure that, you know, we're all interested in making sure that we learn our lessons and learn from our peers and best practice. But TSB, very similar, doing a purchased by a Spanish bank, did a platform migration, and that ended up taking 8 months to roll out. So here, 250,000 customers were impacted over 8 months, unable to access either their accounts, make payments, access ATMs. So again, UK regulations bring them up. And then the last one, Raphael's Bank, which is a card payment service provider. So the issue here was around outsourcing their payments processing. Their processing provider had an outage, affected 3,000 customers, but it happened on Christmas Eve. So again, not the best time for an outage to happen. So the regulators in 2021, up until 2021, released a series, I call it a series of regulations, a whole load of policy statements and supervisory statements of policy around operational resilience. So covering everything from third parties, business operational continuity, impact tolerances. So a lot of it based on the Basel principles of operational resilience. And the key underlying theme of this is to protect the customer from intolerable harm. So quite an honourable goal. You know, prudential regulators have that good ethos around the regulations. So again, the why. Really important to understand, why are these regulations enforced? It's not just a compliance overhead. Now, the one that I like to focus on was the FCA paper, because that gave some really good directives in the articles around what we actually needed to do. And one of the articles was specifically around mapping, so that for an important business service, a firm was able to identify and document the processes, the people, the technology, the facilities, and the information that were used. And not only was that the firm that was within the firm's control, but also anything that was anything that was outsourced to a third party. So parallels here with DORA, which is a European regulation that's coming around for information and communication technologies. But very similar concepts of having the understanding. So this gave us a really good framework to start with in terms of data domains. What information did we need to capture all those important business services to comply with the regulators? And so we started with the important business services and understanding what processes took place to facilitate those services for the customers. And then within those processes, what were the individual process steps, the deliverables, the outcomes that came through those processes, and then the enablers between the people, technology, facilities, and data. And all of this should have some existing documentation in place, standard operating procedures, business continuity, configuration, management. So we already have lots of information that we leverage to capture for the mapping. And again, the purpose of this, why we're not just mapping for the sake of having the understanding, it's so that we can then do some scenario testing against some disruption scenarios to look at where there were any vulnerabilities. If those vulnerabilities would breach the impact tolerances, then the firm would know where they would need to shore up and bolster their processes. So that's the justification. Why we need to do this map. So got some good domains, some useful areas where we needed to focus gathering the information, gathering the data between the process, people, technology, facilities, and information. And then the challenge came that we're dealing with lots of different stakeholders in lots of different countries, and realized very quickly that it wasn't going to be feasible to use a traditional interview method or to do face-to-face workshops. So we devised a questionnaire which made it possible to speak to people much more quickly, but to do it in a way that was also, I mean, if you throw a questionnaire at people, sometimes it doesn't get well responded. So we needed to be quite interactive and quite engaging as well. So we found some of the key questions that we needed to ask. And these were specifically targeted with the future view of being applicable to disruption scenario modeling, so that we could actually start to automate that process as well. So the process step, if it's produced manually or automatically, if there are any workarounds as well. The people aspect was one of the key ones, because one of the scenarios we looked at was the pandemic. So how did people come into the office? How many people were involved in teams, performing the steps? Who was responsible for the quality of information? But obviously, if every process uses technology, we had to work out, so who supported that technology as well? Where were they based? What hours were they working? And then also the last one around facilities management. So who was responsible for the facility to maintain it, to upkeep it? Technology, quite classic, looking at recovery objectives, so recovery time, recovery points, but where was it hosted? What infrastructure was it based on? And what dependencies were there between local and outsourced? And this is where there is the real emphasis here for both UK operational resilience and DORA, because this is looking at the full scope of services, and a lot of IT systems are outsourced. So we would be looking at anything that was managed locally. So I was working in a UK branch, so anything managed locally, anything that would be outsourced but within the group. So an intra-group service could be out to the States or to a European country. And then finally, anything that was outsourced genuinely to a third party, so completely out of our control. So all of these had to be mapped. Facilities, looking at access to the building access, security, fire suppression and control and evacuation procedures, power supplies, uninterrupted power supply, backup generators, network connectivities. There's a whole series of things in logistics. So one of the interesting logistics questions is, with diesel backup generators, how do you resupply the fuel? And in a real crisis, there's a prioritization of other more critical industries that are going to be prioritized to get the fuel resupply before we start. Some interesting questions. And also location came into play as well, in terms of proximity to UK nuclear power stations. So, which is a interesting question to answer. And then finally, the information itself. So what data is flowing through this process, and is it already documented? Is it already managed? And are the procedures already managed? So you can guess already, this questionnaire started drilling down and capturing quite a lot of information. So for every process step, we would cover these 5 domains, and for each of the domains would question those different questions, and then each of those questions would then be applied to multiple disruption scenarios. So the data gets quite big quite quickly. But this is all talking, capturing information in a very structured format that will be ideally managed within a database. But I haven't yet explained how we got to the stage of identifying what the process itself was. And traditionally, you'd be used to process flow modeling, so the box and arrow flow charts, or if more professional, going through UML or BPMN process modeling notations. And these are great for people who understand all the various different icons and attributes and characteristics. But for most lay people, it can be lost in translation, and there is a dependency to look at a diagram and have some documentation or look at that matrix as well. And what I've always tried to do is to keep everything in one page, make sure that the document is comprehensive. And yeah, the notion of the picture paints 1,000 words. So over the years, I've developed a modeling notation, which has generally been quite well received everywhere I've used it. And it simplifies the process and the understanding. So I'll talk you through this. So what this is a traditional process model. So swim lane diagrams. So we've got the pool, which is at the highest level, which is the business service. So you've got top level, the business line, and then the business service, which is focusing. So this introduces the why. Why is this service important? Why is it satisfying customers' demands? And then within that service, there will be a number of different stakeholders, a number of different actors, and those represent the swim lanes. So that's the who, and it should always be aligned to people. So even if there is a fully automated process, that automation is on behalf of somebody, a function, a team. So it's always aligned back to who the process owners are for that particular stage. And then I'll capture where does that team exist? What country, what building? So we've got that. So we're starting to capture, keeping it tangible. And so at this level, at the business function level, this is where you would traditionally see. And this is one of the areas where the regulations were moving away from this functional siloed view of business continuity and trying to instill a notion of service level continuity, so transversal view. And this is where we have to start challenging, because having a service level view of continuity facilitates and accelerates. So in terms of that speeding up process, speeding up recovery, you know exactly the prioritization that needs to be done to restore that service, not focusing on a functional team or operations or IT level. So it's a much more holistic, and so from a crisis management team point of view, better visibility on the important business services that need to be restored. So then, once we've captured this, the next step is looking at the level 3 process stage. So this will be processes go through phases or have outcomes or deliverables. And there may be multiple steps within those, but so that's generally a purpose of why the team doing a particular work. And within that is where we'll see the process steps. So here we'll start to see those standard operating procedures, which should go to an even more granular level in terms of the actual steps that a team needs to perform to do that process. But what the leveling does is, keeping it at level 4, is if a team is, or if an agent is working on a particular IT system, and they may have multiple steps within that system, it's the same person working in the same system. So there's no need to, at this level, there's no need to itemize every single one. They are doing a series of work which has an output, which will go into either another team or another system. So that's one of the rules, that this keeps the diagrams quite concise and neat and uncluttered. But within that process steps, and now we're introducing what are they doing, we understand the timescale. So how long does that process take? And if there are any systems, IT systems, whether it's an IT system, a paper-based system, that's captured here as well. So that's the how. How do they perform that task? So the way the flow works is you start with a trigger. So you start with a customer, end with a customer. So you understand the justification for it. And then there are the flows in between. So the pipelines in between, which will capture what data is moving and how is it moving. And then there's the process steps themselves, which is what processing, what transformation is happening to that data, or what enrichment is happening to that data. If it moves on to, it only moves on to another process step if it goes to another team or another system. And we also captured whether it was a manual or automated process.
Do you assess whether the process step is actually required to deliver the service? Because what you've said is, what you've implied is that the organisation is functionally oriented. So presumably the processes are functionally oriented, but the actual service line might cross those and only require some of the steps. So to actually get the service back, you don't need all the steps, necessarily all the systems.
These steps will only be related to that business service. So,
but if there's intermediate steps that are part of other processes.
Yes, so if there are dependency steps, so all the dependencies. But there is a point. So for instance, KYC, so client onboarding, has to be done for a client to be able to go through the process step. But that isn't a day-to-day process. So if a client issues an order to say, I want to trade, I want to buy, so they've already been onboarded. If there isn't a detrimental issue to the client, if they're not able to get their credit to get a credit note because they're already onboarded. There is an issue to a client if they can't onboard, but that's not a critical harm to them because they're not already in business. So
did you say on the dependencies between systems, is that on another level for technology, or is that your handoff between systems?
So that there's the handoff between systems. Yes. So
dependencies.
Yes. Yeah. So and this comes into play as well if it's going to outsource SaaS systems or so capturing. And so this is where that configuration management information comes in, because a lot of people don't know. If you ask an operations person, when I do this and then it goes to there, there are actually a whole load of other IT systems in between that are doing the handoffs that are dependencies to enable that process. So that's where we capture, working with the IT team and the configuration to capture all of the systems that are actually involved, not just the front end that the operations team are working with. And so reason found this really effective is you have all the information on a page, so make sure that you're comprehensively capturing the factual information about how does that process work. It's visual, so the picture painting 1,000 words rather than having to go through a verbose document or navigating through a database or a spreadsheet. The concepts of leveling ensures that we're getting the right level of granularity and the justification at each level. Why does this process exist? And making sure that we're not digging too deep into the weeds. So again, keeping it concise and readable to the end user.
I'm just wondering how big your piece of paper was. It just feels like it's very big.
Yes, no. So for instance, some processes would have about between 100 to 200 artifacts on them. There was one that was the leveling wasn't quite right, so that exploded, and that was why this kind of principle came into play to put it back into parity with the others. And the thing, so I focus on indexing any what. So if you've got whatever is happening, so that's the effective aspect of the process. That's the bit that gets indexed, and same again for data pipeline, data transferring. That's the bit that gets indexed because that's the tangible aspect.
So does the level 4 have any more to it than that little box? Is there a detail? Is there?
So you can expand down to level 5 and level 6, but for this process, it wouldn't be justifiable to go to that level because time constraints, and you wouldn't be capturing first I take this document and then I copy paste it here and click this button, and that's more in the standard operating procedures.
Yes.
There is some expectation of expertise that staff know how to do their job, but also the understanding that in a crisis scenario, that job should be well enough documented that somebody less experienced could facilitate that.
Did you get situations where people couldn't agree on either on the process or on any of the some of the
which was where this came in really handy, because it pulled out all of the relevant information. So if people were saying, oh, but that step comes before this, or there's something missing in between, they knew, because either the system was missing or the process or how it was. So it exposes more information that visually people were able to see that a bit more quickly.
So this thing that I call critical details. So I'll give an example. In a manufacturing environment, big ERP rollout, 180 factories, stalled on the first one for 6 months because the program had assumed a particular regime for weighing product on leaving factory. First site they got to, they discovered that didn't use that protocol. They then decided to look at all the others, and almost every single factory had a different way of weighing the product. They'd missed the critical detail of do you weigh the pallet as well? Do you have the wrappers on there? What are you actually weighing? Or do you just multiply up the number of goods? You know, each factory had a different protocol. And they had to stop the program, work out what's going on across the whole 180 factories, and work out how to resolve the different processes. So would this pull out that early enough so you don't get into delivery?
So I've used this on other projects where we captured a lot of the KPIs. So here it was purely around mapping the process, so it was quite clean, quite light. Other processes have gone into mapping to include what KPIs are involved, what measures are involved, what risks, so if there's anything on the risk register that's assignable to those processes, and what controls are in place to mitigate against those risks as well. So your question will probably be covered by the metrics aspect of it.
Yeah, but every factory had the same metrics. They just had different definition of the actual underlying process to get to the thing that everybody called weight was different.
Yeah,
and the actual business issue was if you stuck that stuff on a plane,
it has an impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, apologies for being late. You might have covered this. Is the Kipling method named after Rudyard Kipling?
Yes, yeah, it is.
Okay.
So
the temporal aspects, how are they integrated? Because they're the first three things of the Kipling poem. The why, what and how, or something.
Yes, what, why, where, when, how.
Yeah, I can't remember.
So it's the when aspect.
Yeah, but how is that integrated?
Well, there's also the SMART framework that ensures that, so there's the correlation mapping from specifically measure what, specifically define what, measure, how do you measure success, who is it assignable to, where is it realized, and when is the time bound duration to it. So the time bound here, we focused on duration But you can also have the time bound, so from start to elapsed. So if you've got SLAs in place, so again, kind of measuring on the KPIs, you can capture those by adding those metrics in as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to recap on this then, so the lesson we found was that having following the domains from the regulatory text, so this is a very top-down oriented project, gave us really clear focus on what we needed to look at, what questions we needed to ask at every particular point, but also gave that defensible traceability back to the regulatory text to show that we had fulfilled the obligations. And again, so measuring the metrics, if you're focusing on a particular who, what, where, then you can measure how and align the right kind of measurements.
Was there a proactive element to that regulation? So do you have to go out and find vulnerabilities and fix them?
Yes, it was go out, find vulnerabilities and remediate them before March 2025. So there are lots of banks that are currently in
So you
the
couldn't just document and say it's good enough without you tested it in reality.
A purposeful point of a regulation. It's not going through the motions and ticking a box. There is an actual driving motivation for it. So found having those enriched diagrams made it much faster for people to look at and review and understand what the process was defining without having to jump between documents. And it make it quite easy to identify gaps and to challenge the sequencing and the ordering. And finally, so having that digitized questionnaire made it a lot easier to capture the information and then to apply the vulnerability scenario tests to it. But that also meant that one of the part of the regulation is that the process has to be repeated at least every year. They need to reassess. So it makes the process repeatable, easily repeatable, either to reassessment whenever there's a change, but also to expand the scope of disaster disruption scenarios. So we looked at 3 scenarios out of a list of 16. So when they wanted to expand the scenario list, it could be very quickly applied against that database. So any other questions?
What tooling did you use to make that simple connected to the database bit work?
So we started off with, it's a very good question, because it started off being mapped and modeled in Excel. And then we tried looking at third-party off-the-shelf platforms, and none of them went to that level of granularity or had that a sufficient model that we could transfer all of the information to. But we also looked at building an in-house solution, and that was the solution that went whilst a third-party vendor was building up their capability to fulfill, to map with this.
Because I've looked for tools and I can't find anything that you can get the database piece, but it's incomprehensible to anybody. You can do maybe 75% modeling in one tool maximum. You can never get the full scope you need.
The biggest challenge I found is it's not the finding a tool to map, but it's having something that is holistic.
Yeah.
Because you can have modeling in one place, and you have your configuration manager in another place, and they're not connected. So then you end up doubling your maintenance overhead to keep as the change happens. And not only that, it's not mapped to your monitoring telemetry, which is going to tell you if there is an issue with those processes. So there can be so many disconnected artifacts that are telling you the truths of your processes, but aren't talking to each other.
Yeah, lots of partial truths.
Yes, yeah.
So I could dominate this, so I'll let somebody else speak if they will. But I was going to make one quick comment. I think in other industries, I think the issue of not getting there has been the lack of regulatory impetus. I think putting the regulator behind this, I guess, made it happen.
when you've got that scale of fine happening, if you don't get it right, then that's a very good driver to.
Yeah, so just to make sure I understand, so is the process flow modeling that this is now increasingly being required, and that would presumably be after one has done a so-called asset inventory, so that you can map the flows of data between the technical systems, dependencies there, and then the asset owners, because the process would help describe that asset owner and custodian processes as well.
So, and again, so what we were saying before about lots of different systems, you will have a configuration management database that's predominantly used by an IT team to ensure those connections and dependencies. And it should also have the disaster recovery time objectives that are set by the business, but there's no full transparency and visibility back to the business, or there may be a token attribute that says, oh, this relates to that business line or to that business service, but it doesn't relate back to the actual process. Which element of that process is this technology critical for, so that if this fails, we know this particular process will suffer and not just the business line. So I don't know if that was answering your question, but it's you would have, the idea is to have something that is more connected, but again, it's at this stage, it's snapshot documentation. It's still not living, which I'm giving clues away.
I have a question here from online. How the contents get current and reliable in the context of changing campuses?
Yeah. So, very good question. The answer to that is you either have to have a very effective change management team with change management processes that include updating existing documentation, which is something that is always neglected, always, or caveat. But very often, part of change control does not always include verifying that documentation has been updated as well. So that is a challenge in this view, but that's what I was alluding to, the disconnect of doing this. At the moment, we have very static Visio diagrams, charts, models that aren't connected to the real world. So it's not a full digital twin yet. It's a representation, a snapshot representation. Eventually, we should get to a point where those two things are in sync.
And what modeling techniques were used to model the data, and how effective was it?
So there was that process modeling diagram. It essentially was very interview oriented, very workshop oriented. There was only certain amounts of information we could get from standard operating procedures because they would be either out of date or quite verbose, and not specifically identifying. A standard operating procedure will be at the level 5 or level 6, and so it makes it much more challenging to try and pull out, right, what is the actual, you've read about four pages and you say, all right, well, that's all within one system, so that's one process step. So the most effective way was to talk to the experts, to talk to the people who were doing the process through a series of workshops, back and forth. And so that's where, once people had been introduced to the modeling diagram and understood how it works, it was very quick to then do this by email and say, well, here's the updates, and these are the...
You're referring to your diagram?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next case study, which is around record keeping. So again, a regulatory driven project, which was, so started off looking at a number of different regulations. So the key driver was MiFID 2, and this was bolstering on top of the Dodd-Frank Act. But we also took in, it was 19 different regulations and legislations across 14 different territories. to try and look at finding that common thread of record keeping requirements, which was around retention periods, disposal, immutable storage, disclosure. So trying to find that common thread that would apply across as many territories as possible for that minimum set of requirements. And then at the same time, had a team looking at the technology to start capturing the as-is, what was being done. And you can see, so if you've got your top-down requirements, your current status, the end result is to find the gaps, and those are the bits that would need to be updated to fulfill those regulations. And then the final objective was to set up a record management office, a global record management office, into which so the existing US would report to, but also on a European level, and then create an Asian and APAC record management practice as well. So this, when we came in and looked at this, we quickly realized that it was very one directional. It was very focused, the project scope was very focused around record keeping, so putting information into the systems and making sure that it was being captured correctly. There was one element around the disclosure of making sure that you weren't disclosing information inappropriately, so Swiss banking secrecy to US regulators. But what we did was we said there isn't a utility to this. Again, what's the purpose? You know, making sure you're pushing everything in doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to put it back out again. So we looked to see what the key kind of use cases were, and we pushed back to the sponsors and say, well, look, let's add some value to this and make sure that it's actually giving you some usable outputs. So define the project by use case rather than a functional requirement. Rather than a non-functional requirement. And so by moving to a use case oriented output, we found a couple of different cases, a couple of different business functions where this would apply. So the amount of data that we were looking at was the full spectrum of structured data from order management systems, booking systems, clearing settlements, treasury systems, but also looking upstream at communications, so emails and voice communications, documents and brochures that have been sent out, and trading manifests. So it starts to get very complex in terms of correlating all of that information together. And the two real functions that could have the scope of using that was audit, but compliance. So compliance, the second line of defense, had the real the full remit to be able to need to look at all of that information. And so we chose looking at the various different things. So there was either trade supervision, so anti-money laundering areas, but also trade reconstruction. And we decided trade reconstruction was the one that gave the best value back because there was the least amount of existing practice within the company around that. And we proposed that, and compliance rejected. They opposed quite strongly against having any view. Didn't want external consultants coming in, having a look. This was very clearly a data project, and that should be where the focus was. But we had a very good sponsor who understood the reputational and regulatory risks of not being able to respond back to the regulators appropriately. And they endorsed and supported the use case oriented projects.
I didn't hear, you said trade reconstruction?
Yes.
I've not heard that phrase, so this.
So trade reconstruction will be to look at everything that led up to the trades. So why was the trade happening in the first place, which would include messaging. So it could be Bloomberg message chats, could be the phone calls, customer has phoned up and said to place an order, or the email communications, and then the order itself as it's flowed through the trade life cycle.
Why did compliance not want that? It's like a process flow, isn't it?
Yes, so we'll get to that.
Did you have an issue? So in the pharma, I've had a similar issue where I spend a lot of time explaining to people that once we put data in, if it wasn't tagged correctly, they would never get it out. and try to illustrate the disaster that would occur.
It's a classic question of having master data management practices so that you actually know what you're putting in, so that you can put it back out. Having some way of indexing it or retrieving it. So that's also quite classic. But so we moved the project. It went from record keeping to record management with a focus on trade reconstruction. And so the next challenge that I had was to find out, okay, so how did they currently do the trade reconstruction process? How did they respond to regulatory requests? And the first challenge I had, obviously overcoming the initial resistance from the head of compliance, was to find out who currently performed these processes. And I found that there were very few experts that knew how to do this, and they were SPOF. Does anyone know what SPOF? SPOF?
Single point of failure.
Very good. Yep, single point of failure. So if that person, you've got one person who knows the process, if they leave or have an accident, or are sick, unable to come in, the company has lost that capability. And the reason why they're a single point of failure is the processes were ad hoc. Each one was treated entirely independently, separately. There was no documentation how they responded to a regulator request, because the expert knew. They just knew where to go, who to talk to, what they needed to do.
How much in the past could the requests be?
I don't think there is a limit.
So you could go back years.
I guess, yeah.
Not like looking at the last week, where obviously things will be in systems.
The most common ones would be to look at recently what's happened. So, tell us what trades this particular counterparty has had. We're investigating this person, or this company has been having some issues. So show us all the trades that you've done on this particular product. But given a time range as well. It could, but that time range could go back. You saw from the operational resilience, a regulator would fine a company 2 years after the incident had happened. So you could be looking back that far. And I know on another next use case, I think there was 4 years of remediation that had to be looked at. So
yeah, because obviously people change, systems change, processes change over time.
Yeah, which adds the complexity of retrieving information. So because there was no standard on how they would go about performing that trade reconstruction or responding to a regulator's request, we had compliance teams talking with IT teams, but there was no real, either there wasn't the urgency or the communication. There were communication gaps which caused long delays, and there was lots of back and forth between them. And as a result of that, there was a big blame culture. So compliance would complain that IT never delivered what they needed. They had to keep asking for more information to get good quality feedback. And it was delayed. And the IT teams complained that compliance kept changing what they were asking for, and they were never clear about their criteria, and so they had to keep reworking, which was very inefficient from a data perspective. So quite a bit of animosity between compliance and IT. But these are the findings. So the bit about how do I map the process, how did I get to this? And because of that lack of documentation, the only way I could do it by talking with the people. But we decided to do something a little bit more measurable, and we decided to run a simulation to simulate a regulator's request. So we took an existing request, and then we got an IT team to give us a full extract of data. And then from within that, we created a test case of data that we were looking for. We injected that back into the regulatory format. We set a 2-week time limit for the teams to work with. And again, with the sponsor's endorsement, we got the approval and the top-down justification to get everybody's time and effort, because it takes time and effort. You can't just pull people away on a whim. And so we launched our simulated regulatory request for trade reconstruction. And on a daily basis, I would have touch points with the people that I knew who was involved, just to check progress, were they making any progress, and what stage were they at, what stage did they think they were at. I was also copied in all the communications, so I could look at the quality of communication that was going, but also whenever any data was being exchanged, I could start to measure and see how close were they to the scope, how on the mark were they. And at the end of the 2 weeks, so there have been lots of back and forth between the compliance and the technology teams. We drew a close to the simulation, thanked everyone for their time and for their effort, and then drew up our conclusions, which saw the findings, and we presented that back to the steering committee. And judging by these findings, how do you think the response was? It did not go down well.
Some blame, maybe.
And the messenger bore a lot of the belt, but there is a good moral to the story, because now we had a set of knowns. We knew where there were challenges and issues and deficiencies in the process. It was an ad hoc, undocumented, expert-driven process. So we already had some indication of where we need to shore this up. And the way we went about doing that was building the process, so mapping what does a good process, what does best practice look like? And obviously, so responding to case requests was very case management, was a clear-cut indication to have some case management principles around that. So cataloging, logging all the different types of requests that were coming in. And then you'd have a way to measure the start and end date when it was fulfilled. And when you've got a case management system, it needs to be assignable. So we need to identify who would be involved so that they could then block out time to respond to the requests. And the next thing we did was we looked at interpretation. So a regulator's requests for trade reconstruction could be fairly vague or uncertain what scope they're actually asking for. And so we looked at building a template-driven questionnaire to help elicit and identify what were the actual search criteria from the regulator's request that could then be communicated down to the IT teams. And several different types of regulator requests, but I've said this kind of mapped to various different data domains. So whether it was looking at order management data or communications data, or tying everything together, whether it was time bound, so as I said, looking at a date range or a particular counterparty, or a particular product, or if it was even on a particular exchange or a trading venue. So putting out what the regulators were actually asking for. And so that led to having, for all the different types, having some templates in place, and also starting to give some indication of what the responses would look like as well. So it's going to be very structured data, so we're going to get lots of tables, CSV extracts, or it's going to be unstructured data, so there's going to be either lots of documents or recording files. And so by having that as well, we needed to have some way of qualifying how good is the response. So that would be slightly judgment oriented, slightly experience based, but whether we would be expecting 100 trades or 1,000 trades, whether we're expecting recordings or, and also the quality of the recording as well. So it doesn't matter to say, oh, we've recorded a conversation if that conversation is intelligible, because so. And finally, what we put in place was a process of putting in some controls to say how well is this reconstruction process working? Do we have, we added in a level of accountability to say that reporting up to that record management office, to say that the process, how the process was working, how many requests have been coming in, and instilling that notion of continuous improvement. So what we've done was put together a first pass of what the process could look like. Now having a structured, standardized, measurable process, but that's a first pass. They could continue to refine and improve upon it themselves. And given now that they had a series of tools, a series of principles that they could actually focus what to improve on. So another question here, Kipling method. Which one of these do you think is the most applicable to the Kipling method?
Can you, how you do it?
Sorry?
This is how you do it, isn't it?
It's,
Is that what,
so there's one of these.
oh,
Yeah. There's most of it. I'll tell. So well, it involves all of the questions from the method. It's interpretation, because interpretation, move you back on. Interpretation is looking at all of the questions. So is there a particular counterparty who is in question? Are we looking at a particular product, or what type of data are we looking at? What's the time scale that we're looking at? Where was the trades? Where are we looking at it from a venue point of view or from a storage point of view? And how is it kept in mutably storage? Are we able to retrieve it? So this was the one that captured all of the Kipling questions into one.
is that where you would manage the potential of a regulatory request to go like that, and you try to keep it focused on the question asked?
Well, this is the point where if you're unable to fill the questionnaire, you go back to the regulator ask for clarity, ask for more information, so that you avoid that exploding the scope and then not answering the regulator concisely, but also spending a lot more effort with a much larger data set than you actually need. So it makes sure that if you've got the right scope, it does that scoping, keeps it tight, and confirms early with the regulator, is this actually what you're expecting before you even go and so there's that element of communication back and forth as well. It's a relationship. It's the regulators are there to ensure that. So when I was working in process excellence, project excellence, portfolio process and project management office, I likened it to the AA. The PMO was there to assess how projects were working, but also to assist to make sure that they were working well and to do it right. It's exactly the same here. The regulators have a supervisory authority, but it's not to have a big stick and say, we're going to fine you if you get it wrong. It's we want you to get it right. They would rather companies get it right and not have to investigate. So it's making sure that there's a lot of support from those. So kind of the key benefits to this, or the key outcomes, was that process of having to walk through and follow that simulated process was the best way of finding those breadcrumbs and capturing what the process was, because it was undocumented, so we had to find something first.
Did you involve the regulator in that?
No. I don't know since then if there is a supervisory obligation to say, how well are you, so that on that level 2 control, are you able to fulfill your record keeping, and what are you doing to demonstrate that you are fulfilling your record keeping obligations? There may be some aspect of it there to say, well, look, here are our periodic tests where we are making sure we've got the process in place. So this involves asking lots of tough questions, but I was very careful. The thing really important to remember is when you are observing people go through a process, it's very easy to challenge and question why on earth are you doing it like that? So there's no judgment whenever I'm observing an as-is process. There's no, it has to be very observational, not judgmental or opinionated. That comes into the findings afterwards. But during the process, like I said, I'm there to support. Essentially, that's what I'm there for. So by producing these structured contexts, so again, having those domains makes it very, improves the speed and the quality for their trade reconstruction. So the first simulation was incomplete during the 2-week period. Subsequent ones were able to be fulfilled within a 2-week or even within a 1-week period. So it does, by having standards and structures, improves the efficiency. And by having that record management office, centre of excellence, the idea was to try and, rather than having the us and them between IT and compliance, it's having that, fostering that notion of collaboration, that they are working together to fulfil a request from a third party, from the regulator. And by taking that mindset and working as a team, and the same by having the questionnaire that was more communicative and more structured, the idea is to get better morale. So there's less confrontation between the teams and more collaboration. But how am I doing for time?
7:30 now.
Okay. Oh, cool. Okay.
The Center of Excellence is like the whole enterprise, or your team that was putting in that process mapping team?
It's the record management office.
Okay.
So which had responsibility for data storage and data retrieval. So ensuring that retention periods were being upheld and that the disposal was being data disposition, but respecting legal holds, locked records. So there was a lot of
what I thought I picked up was that was a multidisciplinary team. Okay, so it's got the IT people, the data people.
So there was legal teams who were looking at building a regulatory library of requirements, focusing purely on the record keeping aspect. There was the IT team looking at the as-is modelling and the gaps analysis. There was the operations side looking at the processes that were involved, both in terms of storing the data but retrieving the data, and then the governance framework, implementing a target operating model for the executive oversight as well. And that involved compliance, legal, HR, the IT teams, the heads of desk, a lot of different people. I think we had over 250 stakeholders involved purely in the discovery and the aspects. Then obviously there were thousands of people impacted by the final outcomes. So last case study is, so further back in time, was on transaction reporting. So when I came into the team, they had just had an audit from the regulator, who at the time was the FSA, but I'm calling the FCA here because understanding. So there'd been an audit that had found that there was some gaps, a lack of governance in the transaction reporting processes. And at the same time, London Stock Exchange was undergoing a migration of their approved reporting mechanism onto Univista platform. So we had both a pull and a push drivers here for this project. And so from the context, there's again a regulation around transaction reports, which would have been interpreted by business analysts, captured, so specified for developers to build an application that would then actually submit transaction reports. But we weren't just looking at one process. I was actually looking at 5 different business lines, and each business line would have gone through the process independently themselves within their own silos. So you might be able to guess what the outcome of this approach would have taken in multiple different interpretations and implementations. So a bank will go through thousands of transactions a day, so millions over the course of the year. So this was where, and especially over a period of several years, that this needed to be remediated. There was millions of transactions that needed to be looked at. And because of the number the sheer volume of transactions, I decided to take this using a Lean Six Sigma approach. So define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And so we had the remit, the interests from the approved regulatory approved manager, and so we started the project by understanding who people were involved. So having a project team in place, needed to identify what the problem statements were, and what the issues and what the outcome we were trying to achieve. Then looking at all the different transactions that were being submitted, so capturing our measures, our metrics, and that by doing that right at the start gave us our benchmark to see where were we currently. And then it was important to make sure that this capture was automated because it's just not sustainable to do it manually. Then the next step was to look at, okay, so now we've identified our current state. What is our current configuration? So do that as is analysis, and also look at what issues were happening around that. So that root cause analysis, and then map that against the actual regulatory requirements. So what should we be doing? What are we doing? And then map it against what should we be doing? And then, so to improve that, ran a series of workshops, and the group of stakeholders expands as soon as you get to start looking at what a target operating model would look like. The decision was to take a service-oriented view rather than a product-aligned view, and obviously adding in the lack of governance spoke to a lack of control, so adding a control framework in place. And that control framework itself manifested in terms of new tools, new team, and having that governance framework, that ExCo executive accountability. Now, the bit I'm going to focus on here is the analysis, that root cause analysis. Again, so from a process mapping point of view, what were they doing and where was it going wrong? So root cause analysis, first thing that pops into my head is the Ishikawa or fishbone model. So that's how I've chosen to represent these findings. But it was the approach that we took to actually identify where the issues were. So drilling down into this process of what were they doing. So starting from front to back, looked at the regulatory obligations, and quickly saw that from a specification point of view, there were missing requirements, just completely not included, or some of the requirements had been misinterpreted. So weren't clearly defined what the requirement was. So there are gaps. The specifications themselves were quite verbose, were quite big documents. And when we get to that stage, it's not necessarily adding value. So a big document doesn't necessarily mean it's a good document. Less is more. But also because of all those different platforms and systems, we had conflicts between what the specifications were actually saying should be done. But to compound upon that, the IT teams, the developers, had misunderstood, because of the nature of the complexity of the specifications, had misunderstood what the actual outcomes, what the requirement was. So they hadn't developed to the spec. And also, there wouldn't necessarily be some traceability to say, why did this class exist? You can see what it's doing, but how does it relate back to a specification, to the text? So we had a disconnect. And so when you've got bugs, you clearly have a lack of acceptance testing. And you knew this because in the results, in a production environment, there were submissions that were going to the regulators that would either be incomplete or missing data. So either null, blank data, or over reporting, which the regulators don't really like, but every transaction submission costs money, so it's expensive to over report. But missing data, under reporting, is not good from a regulatory point of view. And one of the most surprising ones, so sending submissions through as an XML file, sometimes the files weren't formatted correctly. And so it would just fail right out the gate. And these failures were the only ones that the IT team were actually capturing and supporting. So we realized afterwards there's no monitoring of submissions. So if a submission didn't go at all, there was no error that was flagging it. But also something that came out from the regulations was that the approved reporting mechanism can reject a transaction if it's obviously incorrect or incomplete. So you've got a product and a price, but no notional value or no amount. So they would reject it. And nobody was monitoring these rejections. They were just going into a bucket and accumulating over years. So we had a high number of transactions that needed to be sent, a relatively large number of rejections that weren't being looked at. And this was all done with a team of people looking at all of these various different aspects to try and put out these various different requirements. So the solution to this, so again, I mentioned that service-oriented solution. So the first thing was to look at what the actual requirements were, and rather than having those siloed BAs for each individual business line, to have a holistic team looking across the board. And that would then feed into the IT teams, into the applications to debug all of these issues. But we went further. Rather than debugging what they were currently doing, it was to simplify what they needed to do. And rather than do the selection criteria on an application basis, it was to take a broader scope and push that down into a centralized reporting tool. And that would then be responsible for the selection criteria of what needed to be submitted to the regulators and qualify the information and also process the rejections that were coming back. So we now had a tool that was centrally governing all the submissions, but also applying controls. And from controls, adding that second line of control, so some experts, so created a new operations team, or rather some existing operations officers who were elevated to seconded into the control team. So just doing sanity checks to make sure that the reporting tool was submitting correctly.
Yeah, I'm just interested. So one of the problems was verbose reporting of, I've forgotten on the previous slide, requirements.
It was the verbose translation of the documentation.
Yeah, so it's a business analysis. So that's been replaced by the central reporting tool, correct?
No, so that's writing specification documents.
Okay.
So that's been replaced by effectively redoing that work, doing it holistically across all 5 business lines, rather than having 5 independent people applying their interpretation of the regulations.
Yeah.
So fewer people doing it more holistically meant more consistency around what those requirements were.
How did you get to this as a business solution? Because you've fundamentally broken the organisation, the processes and the systems by doing this.
Yeah.
So how did you manage that piece? Because that's... you didn't just have a workshop, which is what they sort of suggest.
No, this took several months. This was over a series of months. We had some consultancies who came in as well. And it was off the back of that, if you come with that root cause analysis, finding where all those issues were, we realized actually it was better to re-engineer or to redesign the process from scratch rather than to patch all of those different issues. Because by taking out the submission selection criteria and having each of those platforms submit to the regulators and each of them failing in multiple different ways, we now only have one central point of submission to the regulator.
What I'm getting at is that you potentially upset a lot of people.
Yes.
A lot of politics involved in here. Yeah, it's very easy in hindsight to say this was the logical way through it, but when you're at the front of it and everybody wants to keep their little fiefdom, their own teams and their own systems.
Yeah. But again, with the regulatory obligation saying that what is the current status is causing lots of failure, there are lots of failures still happening every day. Remember, these are ongoing on a daily basis. Plus, there's lots of transactions that need to be resubmitted, and that number. The idea was to try and stem. You know, the first thing you try and do when you've got a problem is stop the cause of the problem, not try and remediate the issue. It's like putting plastic out of the ocean isn't going to solve anything if you stop the plastic going in the first place.
Was there somebody there with a big stick?
Yeah, it's called
Internally. 'Cause
Yes, internally. So the CF29A, which is the regulatory appointed manager, so who has a legal obligation to oversee this and has personal repercussions if they don't. So yeah, that was quite a big stick internally.
I was in an organization, we were doing this kind of thing, and we needed the commitment from the CEO.
So we had head of territory, the local CEO.
Right, because they are concerned about the reputational aspects of the regulatory. So that really does, yeah, you usually get the, as long as they know all the politics. And it kind of gets diluted a bit because they know they have to do this. Yeah.
And that's exactly my final point is we put those controls in place for the executive committee, which involves the CEO of territory. So, yeah, that's exactly right. So again, kind of the lessons here, doing that we need to do reverse engineering and process mining. I love the word process mining. It's really digging for gold. So taking that structured approach, Six Sigma, the biggest benefit of the Six Sigma was taking those initial benchmarks. Because if you don't know where you're starting from, how can you ever demonstrate the benefit or the success of the outcome? And having that centralized processing, so reducing the amount of duplication, having one reporting tool, one control team. So having that standards streamlined and improved a lot of the processes. 10 minutes, I think thereabouts-ish.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I want to go into the future. So, big buzzword, AI. So AI, it's going to automate. We've already got RPA, remote process automation. It will assist in processes, and which is in parallel, and then eventually we'll have augmented process management. And I think this falls into 3 different areas. So the first one where it will help is in discovery of our existing processes. So you've got a vast amount of documentation all over the place that is quite often written and shelved, forgotten about, not maintained, not kept up to date. So having a process that will be able to utilize that, so these models that are able to consult that information and put out the information quite quickly. So just ask it, it's RAG, I can't remember what RAG is. And then we've got the notion of discovering, so looking at data itself, looking at the lineage, so identifying identifiers, so trade ID, and seeing, okay, that's come from one system to the next system to the next, so building the lineage. And that then can facilitate automating the process mining. So today, process mining is traditionally done looking at SQL logs, or builds some SQL views on the back of that and go into a mining tool. But finding ways of automatically pulling all that information out and doing the classification. So tagging and classifying information so that it also is then catalogued and part of that master data management, doing that automatically rather than trying to pre-think how it needs to be done. Another area where I find it where it'd be really interesting is the modelling. So at the moment, we're doing the modelling manually. So like I said, lots of interviews. It'd be great if an AI could go from text from a document or just from dictation, just from somebody describing, first I do A, then I do B, and then somebody else will do C, and for it to automatically build the diagram for you. Conversely, do that the other way around. You've got a diagram, put out what are the key areas, the attributes that we then need to map. So for vulnerability assessment, for scenario, for impact scenario modeling. The idea of building those relationships. So one thing about the lineage tells you what comes first, what comes second, but then actually identify and document what is that relationship? Is it a child? Is it a parent? What are those dependencies? And for a model, you can automatically see where the bottlenecks are, where the issues are, and try and do some self-optimization. Another area where I think could be really helpful is the monitoring. So the idea of, I've worked on other projects where we've taken telemetry, so things like Splunk and Datadog, and tying that directly to the process, so you can already see where technical issues will be occurring in a real-time view. And on the back of that, building those KPIs, building those measurements, and telling you there are some trends and patterns that are happening outside of the normal deviations. Maybe this will be of interest to you. And so I've put recovery. So from a resilience point of view, we're currently hosting lots of databases in VMs, and VMs are already able to automatically fail over for recovery. But having that monitoring in place could be really good. So I did some research into what platforms are out there at the moment that are doing process mapping and process modeling. And it falls into two different types of camps. One is text to model. And this is typically in a markdown notation. So you need to have this very specific syntax, and that will then draw your block and arrow flowcharts. So it's not quite going from a document. It needs to be in this structure. The other view is companies like Solaris, which is from the bottom up. So looking at those log files, translating those into SQL views, and that then builds. So it's very dependent on an analyst configuring the sequence of events. They can then build that process mining view. From there, it can reverse engineer your business process model. So that's the bottom up view, but again, very dependent on an analyst doing that analytical work in the first place. So between these two different types of approaches, there is then an exponential growth in applications, platforms, and systems that are coming out on the market. Or when you say there's an AI for that, there are loads, and each of them will continue to evolve in terms of their capabilities. And there's some quite big names there as well, the likes of IBM, Pega, and Solaris. But it's quite interesting. I'm quite optimistic in how the future will look. I'm quite minded to have a go at building one, because of that. The modeling notation that I've used, having a system that could build that for me, but then keep it live and interact with other monitoring information as well. So yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. Please link in with me. I'd be really interested to carry on the conversations and see where the future goes with this.
There is no questions.
No questions. Oh. Well, we have no questions. Well, thank you very much for that. That was astonishing. And I started off learning about financial services, as I don't work in that sort of environment. But a point came in that, and I thought, he's actually talking about the thing that I do, which is nothing to do with financial services. So I specifically found the things about trade reconstruction, even though I don't have trade. I have transactions though, so the transaction reporting was valid as well. So I think that's one of the good things about these BCS events, is that there's usually something that just suddenly something comes across that is transferable for different types of business, tools and techniques. So that's marvelous. So thank you very much indeed for that. So Well, to say to everyone, people online and people here, that the next event of the Business Change Group is being held in jointly with the South Yorkshire branch, where Andy Shaw will be talking about mental health, a time for change in the tech industry, showing how people can manage their own mental health and help others as well. And has spoken to us on similar subjects before. Well worth taking part in that. Again, all sorts of lessons to learn, and working with teams, working with other people as well. That's really great. And so I think the only thing now is networking afterwards. So thank you very much to the people who are online, and the rest of us can gather together in our Braidgate area and continue our discussions of this topic. So thank you very much.